There is a Hebrew word at the center of this story. The word is navi. It is the word your Bible translates as prophet, and the scholars will tell you it comes from a root that means to bubble up. The way water rises through rock it cannot contain. The way pressure finds a crack and pushes through. A prophet is not someone who chose to speak. A prophet is someone through whom something had to speak. Something that would not stay quiet. For 400 years, in the centuries before and after the Great Exile, God placed that pressure inside ordinary people. Farmers, priests, fishermen, a fig grower from the southern hills. He broke them open in ways they did not ask for and did not want. And then he spoke through the cracks. This is not a list of Bible characters. This is not a theology lesson. This is not a history lecture. This is the story of what God does to a person before he speaks through them. One of them ran so far from his calling that he ended up swallowed alive in the dark belly of a sea creature, and even then, could not escape the voice that had found him. One of them was thrown into a muddy cistern by the very city he was trying to save, left to die in the dark with his knees sinking into the muck. One of them called fire down from heaven in the morning and begged God to let him die by afternoon. And one of them, the last one, the one history could not kill, fell on a black volcanic rock in the middle of the Aegean Sea and heard a voice so enormous the whole sky seemed to crack open. We will get to that last one, but not yet, because before we get to the end of the prophetic story, you need to understand how it begins. And it always, every single time, without exception, begins the same way, with breaking. The Hebrew prophets did not stride into history polished and ready. They stumbled in. They protested. They ran. They sat under trees and asked God to end their lives. They wept so publicly that their tears became part of the historical record. They married women who left them. They preached sermons nobody wanted to hear in cities that were already on fire. And yet, and here is the thing that will stay with you long after this video ends, every single one of them was right. Not one of them was wrong. In the entire prophetic corpus of the Hebrew Bible, covering nearly 500 years of history, not one prophet who was genuinely sent by God spoke a word that failed to come true. Their methods were strange. Their lives were hard. Their audiences rejected them almost universally. But the words held. So who were these people? Why these people? Why the farmer, the fugitive, the man with unclean lips, the one who cried until the book that bears his name is named after the Hebrew word for weeping? Here in Apos, that's what most people miss. God did not choose the prophets because they were impressive. He chose them because they were available, and then he made them available by breaking everything else. Let Apos begin. The year King Uzziah died is the year everything changed for a man named Isaiah. Uzziah had ruled for 52 years. He was the longest reigning king in Judah and Apos' history. He built towers. He dug cisterns. He had an army of 307,500 men. Under Uzziah, Jerusalem felt permanent. Under Uzziah, the future felt manageable. And then Uzziah died. Isaiah does not tell us where he was when he heard the news. He tells us only where he ended up. In the temple, in the year of the king and Apos' death, surrounded by smoke and light, and the sound of seraphim calling to one another with voices that shook the doorposts of the building itself. You can imagine what it cost a man who had spent his life in the courts of kings to walk into the presence of something that made kings look like children and Apos' toys. The first thing out of Isaiah and Apos' mouth is not a prophecy. It is not a sermon. It is not a mission statement. It is a cry of undoing. End quote. Woe to me, end quote, he says. End quote, I am ruined. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. End quote. He is not being humble. He is being accurate. In the presence of holiness, actual holiness, the thing itself, not a concept or a doctrine, a man does not feel inspired. He feels finished. He feels like a person who has just realized that everything he thought was solid was made of paper, and the paper is burning. And then, only then, after the undoing, the sending, a seraph flies to him with a coal from the altar. The coal touches his lips. End quote. Your guilt is taken away, end quote, the seraph says. End quote. Your sin is atoned for, end quote. And God speaks. Not to Isaiah specifically. God speaks into the room, end quote. Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? End quote. And Isaiah, still smoking from his encounter with the altar coal, still trembling from the sound of the doorposts, still barely standing, says, end quote, "Here I am. Send me," end quote. That is the moment. Right there. Not before the undoing. After it. Jeremiah had a different problem. He did not need to be undone. He was already undone. He was young. Tradition places him in his late teens when God called him, and he had not yet developed the useful illusion that he was capable of anything significant. He knew he was nobody. End quote. "I do not know how to speak," end quote, he told God. End quote. "I am too young," end quote. God and Apos' response is one of the most direct rebuttals in the entire Bible. He does not argue with Jeremiah. He does not explain himself. He does not say, "Actually, Jeremiah, you are more qualified than you think." He simply says, end quote, "Do not say you are too young. You will go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you," end quote. And then he reaches out. Jeremiah records this moment with the unnerving specificity of a man who can still feel it decades later, and touches Jeremiah and Apos' mouth. End quote. "I have put my words in your mouth," end quote, God says. Jeremiah did not want those words. He spent the next 60 years of his life wishing he could give them back. He wrote the most honest complaint in all of Scripture. End quote. "His word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot." End quote. That is not enthusiasm. That is not a man who loves his calling. That is a man who tried to quit and discovered that quitting was not an option. The word had been placed inside him, and it would not stay. There is a moment in Jeremiah and Apos' story that Josephus, the Jewish historian, recorded in his Antiquities of the Jews with enough specificity that you know he was working from reliable sources. It is the moment when the officials of Jerusalem, the people Jeremiah had spent his entire adult life trying to warn, finally lost their patience with him. They took him and they lowered him by ropes into a cistern in the courtyard of the prison. Not a clean cistern. A cistern that had been emptied of its water and had not been cleaned. A stone pit, underground, dark, with nothing at the bottom but thick mud. Jeremiah, somewhere in his 60s by this point, sank into that mud up to his armpits. And there the officials left him, to die slowly in the dark. This was not punishment for lying. He had not lied. Every word he had preached about Babylon, about the fall of Jerusalem, about the consequences of the city and Apos' choices, all of it was true and all of it was coming. The city and Apos' leaders knew it was true. That was precisely why they wanted him dead. The truth was inconvenient. The truth was bad for morale. The truth was the one thing they could not afford to let the people hear. So they threw the man who carried it into a hole in the ground. An Ethiopian palace official named Ebed-Melech eventually pulled him out, using worn-out clothes and rags as padding for the ropes so they would not cut into his arms. Jeremiah was returned to the courtyard of the guard, and he kept preaching. Sit with this for a moment. Jeremiah preached for 60 years, and almost no one listened. Jerusalem fell anyway, exactly as he said it would. He was taken to Egypt against his will by the survivors who ignored his advice. Tradition says he died there, alone. He never saw a revival. He never saw a crowd come to faith because of his words. He never saw the thing he worked for succeed in his lifetime. But it gets stranger, because the same pattern, the calling, the breaking, the endurance, the outcome that comes too late to see, shows up 500 miles north, a generation earlier, in the life of a man named Elijah. Elijah is the prophet who called fire from heaven. He stood on Mount Carmel before 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah, 850 people whose entire professional existence depended on proving him wrong, and he called fire down from the sky. The fire came. The prophets of Baal were silenced. King Ahab watched it happen with his own eyes. And then Queen Jezebel sent Elijah a message. She was going to have him killed by the next morning. And Elijah, the man who had just called fire from heaven, ran. He ran into the wilderness until he couldn't and Apos' run anymore. He sat down under a broom tree, a small, scrubby desert shrub that provided almost no shade, and he said to God, and quote, "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors," end quote. He lay down and went asleep. God did not respond with a rebuke. He did not remind Elijah of the fire, of the victory, of the prophets of Baal who were no longer a problem. God sent an angel with food. Twice. Fresh baked bread. a jar of water. The angel touched Elijah and Apos' shoulder and said, end quote, get up and eat, because the journey is too much for you. End quote. Not get up and stop being dramatic. Not get up and remember who you are. Just, the journey is too much for you. Eat something. The prophet was allowed to be exhausted. The prophet was allowed to collapse. The prophet was given bread and water and permission to rest. And then God gave him a new assignment. Across these three men, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Elijah, none of them were broken once and then fixed. They carried their brokenness with them, all the way through. And the message came through anyway. In some cases, because of it. Now we look at three men who are, in some ways, more honest than all the rest. One of them ran from God. One of them had no business being a prophet by any standard the religious system of his day recognized. And one of them was ordered by God to live his message inside his own marriage, to feel, in his own body and his own heart, what God felt for the people he was trying to reach. Start with the runner. Jonah ben Amittai was from Gath-Hepher, a small village in Galilee. He is the only prophet in the entire Hebrew Bible whom Jesus compared himself to directly. End quote. As Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish. End quote. Jesus said, end quote, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. End quote. Jesus did not compare himself to Isaiah, not to Elijah, not to Jeremiah, to Jonah, the man who ran. God told Jonah to go east, to the great Assyrian city of Nineveh, and preach against it. Jonah went west. He bought passage on a ship to Tarshish, possibly the southern coast of Spain, the farthest point in the known world from where he was supposed to be going. He went below deck. He fell asleep. The storm God sent was so violent that seasoned sailors, men who had crossed the Mediterranean their entire careers, were terrified. They threw the cargo overboard. They prayed to every god they knew. And Jonah slept. Pay attention to this. They woke him up. They cast lots to find the source of the problem, and the lot fell on Jonah. And Jonah, to his credit, and perhaps the most dignified thing he does in the entire book, told them the truth. End quote. I am a Hebrew, end quote, he said. End quote. I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. And I am running from him. Throw me overboard, end quote. They threw him overboard. And God prepared a great fish. 3 days inside that animal. In the dark. In the deep. Jonah prayed from inside the fish. One of the most extraordinary prayers in Scripture. A man calling on God from inside what should have been his grave. And the fish vomited him onto dry land. God spoke to Jonah a second time. The same message. End quote. Go to Nineveh. End quote. This time, Jonah went. He walked into the city and preached 8 words. In the Hebrew original, it is only 8 words. 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown. That is the entire sermon. No exposition. No illustrations. No altar call. 120,000 people repented. The largest recorded revival in the Hebrew Bible was preached by a reluctant prophet in 8 words. And here in Apos, the part nobody tells you, Jonah was furious. He sat outside the city on the eastern side and sulked. He told God to his face, end quote, this is what I was afraid of. I knew you were a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love. I knew you would forgive them. That is why I ran. End quote. He would rather have seen Nineveh destroyed than watch God extend mercy to people he considered enemies. God and Apos' response was to grow a leafy plant over Jonah and Apos' head to shade him, and then let a worm eat it overnight, and then ask Jonah a single question. End quote. You are upset about the plant. Should I not be concerned about Nineveh, a city with more than 120,000 people who do not know their right hand from their left? End quote. The book ends there. No resolution. No apology from Jonah. Just the question, hanging in the air. Now, Amos. Amos was a shepherd from Tekoa, a village south of Bethlehem. He also tended sycamore fig trees, a specific kind of manual work that involved puncturing the fruit at exactly the right stage so it would ripen properly. He was not a prophet and Apos' son. He had no prophetic training. He had no institutional credentials of any kind. And God sent him north, to Bethel, the royal sanctuary of the northern kingdom, the seat of official religion under Jeroboam II, and told him to preach. Amos walked up to the royal priest, a man named Amaziah, and told him to his face, "Jeroboam will die by the sword, and Israel will certainly go into exile." Amaziah told Amos to go back where he came from. End quote. Don and Apos, T prophesy here anymore, end quote, he said. End quote. This is the king and Apos' sanctuary and the temple of the kingdom, end quote. Amos looked at him and said words that have burned through 4,000 years of religious history, end quote. I was neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet. I was a shepherd, and I also took care of sycamore fig trees. But the Lord took me from tending the flock and said to me, "Go, prophesy to my people Israel." End quote. Not my idea, not my choice, not my credentials. And then there is Hosea. God did not just tell Hosea what to say. God told him what to do. And what God told him to do was one of the most costly commands in the entire prophetic tradition. End quote. Go, end quote. God said, end quote. Marry a promiscuous woman, end quote. Hosea married a woman named Gomer. Gomer left him. Repeatedly. She went back to other men. And each time, God told Hosea to go find her, to love her, to bring her back. At one point, and this is in the text, chapter 3 of Hosea, Hosea found Gomer in what appears to have been slavery or debt bondage, and he paid 15 pieces of silver and a measure of barley to buy her back. The meaning was not subtle. God was not asking Hosea to illustrate a sermon. God was asking Hosea to live one. Every morning Hosea woke up next to a woman who might leave him again was a morning in which he understood, in his bones, what God felt about Israel. Every time he went to find her was every time God went to find his people. Here in Apos, that's what most people miss. The book of Hosea is the most emotionally raw portrayal of God and Apos' inner life in the entire Old Testament. End quote. How can I give you up, Ephraim? End quote. God says through Hosea. End quote. How can I hand you over, Israel? My heart is changed within me. All my compassion is aroused. End quote. That line was not written in a study. It was lived in a marriage that cost Hosea everything. Now we come to the last one. The black volcanic rock is called Patmos. It sits in the Aegean Sea between the coast of Turkey and the Greek island of Ikaria, a small, jagged island of about 13 square miles that the Roman Empire used as a place to send people who needed to disappear, not to be executed, to be forgotten. John the Apostle, the son of Zebedee, the one who leaned against Jesus at the Last Supper, the one who ran to the empty tomb, was sent there by the Emperor Domitian sometime around the year 95 of the Common Era. Eusebius, the early church historian, tells us that John had been brought to Rome before the exile, that he had survived being put into boiling oil and emerged unharmed, and that Domitian, unsure what to do with a man who would not die and would not stop speaking, banished him to Patmos instead. Think about what that means for a moment. James was beheaded. Peter was crucified upside down. Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross. Thomas was speared. Matthew was killed by the sword. Philip was crucified. Bartholomew was skinned alive. Thaddeus was clubbed to death. Simon the Zealot was sawn in half. Matthias was stoned and beheaded. Paul was beheaded in Rome. And John, still alive, still exiled, still writing. A man in his 90s on a volcanic island in the middle of the sea, the last living witness to the resurrection, surrounded by the Aegean, outliving everyone he had ever loved. There is a kind of suffering in that which does not have a simple name. Not martyrdom, something quieter, something that requires more sustained endurance than a single moment of death. On Patmos, John heard a voice. He tells us in the first chapter of Revelation that it sounded like a trumpet, clear, loud, impossible to ignore or mishear. He turned to see who was speaking, and he saw a figure like a son of man, robed to his feet, his hair white as wool, his eyes like a flame of fire, his feet like bronze glowing in a furnace, his voice like the sound of rushing waters. And John, the man who had walked with Jesus for 3 years, who had witnessed the transfiguration, who had stood at the foot of the cross, who had seen the risen Christ with his own eyes, fell at the figure and Apos' feet as though dead. The same thing that happened to Isaiah in the temple happened to John on a volcanic island 6 decades later. The encounter with the actual presence of the divine is not inspiring. It is annihilating. And the hand of the risen Christ reached down and touched John and Apos' shoulder. End quote. Do not be afraid, end quote, the voice said. End quote. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look. I am alive forever and ever. End quote. The voice that had undone Isaiah in the temple, that had silenced Jeremiah and Apos' protest, that had fed Elijah bread under the broom tree, that had caught Jonah in the dark of the sea, that had pulled Amos out of a sycamore fig grove and sent him into the royal sanctuary, that had asked Hosea to love a woman who would leave him so that God could say through him what God felt. That same voice found the last surviving apostle on a forgotten volcanic rock in the middle of the Aegean, and it said, "Do not be afraid. There is a person watching this tonight who is sitting somewhere quiet, worn down in a way that is hard to explain to anyone who hasn't and Apos, felt it, who has said, like Elijah, end quote, I have had enough, end quote, who has said, like Jeremiah, end quote, the word is like fire in my bones and I am weary of holding it, end quote, who has said, like Jonah, end quote, Lord, just take my life. This is not what I signed up for, end quote. The prophets and Apos' lives are saying something back to you. God does not call the equipped. He equips the called. And his preferred tool of equipping is the thing you have been trying to survive. Not because suffering is good in itself, but because Navi, that ancient Hebrew word for prophet, means to bubble up. The message doesn't and Apos' come from people who have everything together. It comes from people who have been cracked open enough that it has somewhere to go. So here's what the prophets want you to take with you. The first thing is this. Every prophet God used was broken before they were useful. Not polished. Not credentialed. Not self-assured. Broken. Isaiah was undone in the temple before he was sent. Jeremiah protested his own calling for 60 years. Elijah collapsed under a shrub after his greatest miracle. Jonah ran to the edge of the world. Amos had no formal training, no lineage, no platform. Hosea had a marriage that tore him open every morning. And John was 90 years old on a volcanic island, the last man standing, when the final revelation came. The pattern holds across every prophet in the canon. God speaks through the cracks. The second thing is this. If your life has cracked you open, if you have been in the cistern, if you have sat under the broom tree, if you have spent time in the belly of the thing you were running from, you may be closer to your purpose than you think. You may have assumed the breaking disqualified you. The prophets suggest the opposite. God does not wait until you are strong. He meets you in the mud, at the bottom of the pit, on a black volcanic rock where you have been sent to disappear, and he puts his hand on your shoulder and says, "Do not be afraid. There is still a word to be spoken, and I have chosen you to speak it." The third thing, and this is the one I want to leave you with, is the thing you see only when you look at all of them together. Not one of them finished what they started. Isaiah did not see the return from exile he prophesied. Jeremiah never saw Jerusalem restored. Elijah did not live to see the end of Baal worship. Jonah left Nineveh angry. Amos was driven out of Bethel. Hosea preached for 60 years to a kingdom that fell anyway. And yet every word they spoke was true. Every word held. The prophets were not paid in outcomes. They were paid in faithfulness. And the only qualification any of them had, the only thing every single one of them shared, is that when God said go, they went. Eventually, even the reluctant ones, even the ones who ran, even the ones who wept, even the one who asked God to end his life and was given bread instead, they went. Which prophet and Apos' story hit you hardest in this video? Tell me in the comments below. I read every one. The word Navi means to bubble up. God does not put his words in the mouths of people who have everything together. He puts them in the mouths of people who are already broken open. And if you are broken open tonight, you are not disqualified. You may be exactly where you need to be.